Hello, friends. This is Tusk. Now, I'm not exactly sure how I'd like to start this since I'm not exactly sure where this will be posted or if it'll even be posted at all. Um, but I'll begin with an introduction just in case this gets posted somewhere where people I don't know or people that don't know me can find it. So if you don't know me, I'll introduce myself again. I am Tusk. You can find me on X, formerly Twitter.com, at Tusk Drawings, where I post drawings. Alternatively, you can find me on the same site at Tusk Posting, but I wouldn't recommend that because on that account I generally just act the fool and ramble incoherently about whatever is on my mind at any given moment. Now, the topic of today's discussion is related to, or I guess intrinsically reliant upon, what I am doing with my time. Uh, and if you do not know me, or have never seen anything that I have produced ever, um, then I would like to let you know that I am currently in the process of writing and developing a visual novel video game titled Six and the Woods. It is a dark fantasy story following six people as they journey through a magical forest, etc., etc. Now, the topic of today's discussion is related to the codex function that I have been writing out and implementing lately. And if you don't know what a codex function is in visual novel games or in games with visual novel elements, generally there is a codex function in which the player can, reference various terms or names, etc., just for whatever reason, if they need to refresh themselves on what a certain thing means or anything like that. If they want to learn more about a certain term, it's there. It's usually a button in the menu. You go to codex. You want to, remember what a character's name is, who they are, what a certain place is, that kind of thing. Now, for the purposes of my story, I am very, very, I don't know if I should say frustrated, but I've been putting a lot of thought into the codex system, specifically how I'm going to be implementing it and how I'm going to be using it to present certain information. Because it might not seem like it, but it actually will be making or breaking the execution of this story. Because in this story, the presentation of information, that being how it's presented and when it's presented, is very, 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 very important. It is impossible to overstate how important that is. This story is based around one of the biggest themes of this story is the idea of secrets, secrets that people keep, secrets that are hidden in the past, and then, of course, the effects that those secrets have once they're revealed. So the presentation of information becomes very important. And since this is a fantasy story, a lot of that information is going to be brand new and completely unknown to whoever's reading it. So it has to be presented in a way that they can digest easily and understand easily, at least enough to understand what's going on in the story. So my main goal is to utilize the codex function as little as possible to teach the important things. I'd like the important things to be presented within the bounds of the story already, because at the end of the day, I can't count on anyone reading the codex. Even though this is a game about reading, that doesn't necessarily mean people are going to read the codex. That's because generally the codex is going to be viewed as an ancillary or additional content. So it's not something I can necessarily count on like I can the actual body of the story. So then the issue becomes, how do I introduce this important information into the story in a way that doesn't break the sense of immersion? Because I'm sure if you've read any story at all, you can remember a situation in which a character just explains something about the world or some kind of system to someone else, even though both people that that are talking should already know all the intricacies or whatever about that. That explanation is being made solely for the sake of the audience, and it can be very jarring sometimes. Um, but again, I'm sure you know that. Basically, I want to avoid that as much as possible, and partially in the way of doing that, exists the character of the scholaress. Now, if you don't know who that is, I apologize, but I'm not going to explain. Uh, I'm not going to give an overview of all the different characters. If you'd like to know, go on at Tusk Drawings on X.com and find out. But anyways, character of the scholaress opens up a lot of avenues for explanation due to her nature as kind of a researcher or a seeker of secrets, in that she is very, very prone to asking questions about things, and as a foreigner, she doesn't usually know the answers already. Um, Now, of course, I don't want to overuse that uh, tool, because I don't want everything to just become, you know, everybody explains everything to scholaress. That could get very old very quickly. So then the issue then becomes, how do I parse that information between scholaress and the codex and other characters? Because this story is going to be told through the perspectives of the Six in the Woods individually. So there will be certain sections where the point of view character is the scholaress, certain sections where the point of view character is the guide, certain parts where the point of view character is the exile, etc., etc. So as these different characters experience different things, they will know different things, and they will, ask different questions. So my intent is to hopefully, from the audience perspective, build out that base of proper information in that way, so it's not getting monotonous with how things are explained, because what the scholaress understands already as fact is different from what the exile would understand already as fact. So certain things the scholaress might be thinking in her head, oh, this is like, that, or the exile might think that about other things, and they might ask questions about the kind of things that either character had already understood as fact. Um, and my intent with that sort of interplay between the characters' perspectives is to build out a broader base for uh, the audience's understanding of the world, and that, while they are introduced to certain concepts with one character, their understanding might be refined by the knowledge of another character. That way, there isn't always just a back and forth of, oh, what is this? Oh, this is blah, blah, blah. Because, again, that could be very monotonous, and it just turns everything into a repeat of, let's explain this to this character, and so on and so forth. Um, and back onto the topic of secrets, and that being a central theme of the story, again calls to mind the importance of how information is presented in this story, because when every character has their own secrets that they're keeping from every other character, or in some cases from themselves, the information that you know about any given thing at any given time can drastically change how you view certain things. So I want to make sure that for certain story moments, the audience has all the information they need in order to experience it the way I want them to. Uh, so in a situation where I can't count on them having read the codex, I don't want to hide important information behind that wall, however short that wall might be. So I want to make sure that all that information is presented within the bounds of the bulk of the story. And I'm sure that if you're listening to this, you might have some interest in the broader genre of fantasy, and I'm sure that you might be thinking about how this exhibits some issues that are kind of prevalent in a lot of fantasy stories that you see nowadays. Um, and there are a lot of issues with modern fantasy. There's all sorts of buzzwords or terms you can come, like D&Dification, the woke, all that stuff. Um, but one of the main issues that I've had spoken to me about whenever I've talked to anyone about fantasy is the prevalence of things like proper nouns and unknown information. Because when you compare a fantasy story to something like an urban fantasy story, with an urban fantasy story, if say there's like a split between a real world and a spirit world, and the main character is from the real world, that allows the audience to assume and understand implicitly certain things about the world and characters that they can't really do in a fully fantasy world. Because if there's a real world, then the audience can impress their own understanding of the real world onto that story. And there's a lot less legwork that needs to be done to build a relationship between the characters and the audience. But in a typical fantasy story, in a completely made up world, with made up places, made up names, all that, there's a much greater barrier to entry. And this is one of the reasons why, in a lot of fantasy stories, especially what people consider lower quality fantasy stories nowadays, even though a lot of higher quality ones still follow these trends, you see things like certain tropes and kind of stock settings appear, where you have your adventurers guilds, your mages guilds, your elves, your orcs, your dwarves. A lot of people see this as a symptom of the so-called D&Dification of fantasy, which in a lot of cases it can be. But in my opinion, I believe it's more of a symptom of the modern audience's lack of attention span and lack of patience for getting into certain things, where authors feel the need, or not really even feel the need, but the need has been shown that authors kind of usually need to utilize certain already understood aspects and tropes like adventurers guilds and elves and dwarves, because the average reader will already know broadly what those things are. You don't need to explain that the elves are immortal whatevers, or that the dwarves like to smith, or that the adventurers guilds will send people on quests to slay dragons, because the audience already knows that. It's time saved, and when the audience has such a short attention span, that means a lot. Every second matters. So that is one of the big ways that a lot of current fantasy stories get around this. You see this in things like, people love Freerin, but that has so many tropes that people associate with, poor quality, low level fantasy. It has, the immortal elves. It has the mages guilds. It has, all that stuff. So I disagree with when people say that that is the marker of bad fantasy, although you don't see it that much unless you're talking to stupid people. But basically, all this to say, I'm not doing any of that. Um, I'm not using any of those familiar tropes, or really many of those familiar tropes. I don't have elves. I don't have adventurers guilds. I don't have a lot of those easy on-ramp tools that are so prevalent in modern fantasy. So I have to do a bit more thinking. I have to put a bit more forethought into how I'm presenting information, because this is a very dense world. There's a lot of new information. There's a lot of proper nouns. There's a lot going on. And I think, I'm hoping that for anyone with the attention span to follow through and, experience it, that it'll be worth it, and that it'll be, deep enough to enjoy and, read more of. But not everyone's going to have that faith going into it, and that willingness to feel out a story until it catches its stride. So I have to be very considerate of the entry point, which, that comes back to the codex, because codexes have a lot of information. And I'm sure that if you have read a visual novel or any game with a codex, I'm sure that there might have been a situation or two where you've opened up the codex and there was just walls of text, and you thought, no, I'll read that later, and then you never read it. I know I have done that once or twice, and I'm sure that many, many people have done that. So I don't want to do that because, like I said previously, the codex is very important to how I want to convey information. Now, I know I said I want to utilize the codex as little as possible for conveying important information, but that does not diminish the fact that it is still a very useful tool for conveying information. Now, I want to call back to mind an example of the codex function that I mentioned very, very early on in this little discussion, in that I mentioned that some games will have a function in which certain words within the text will be highlighted. Words like names, names of places, etc. And then you can hover over that word or click on it, and it will expand with a little short, succinct, very matter of fact and to the point description of whatever that term that is highlighted means. And I think within the bounds of a fantasy visual novel video game, I think this is probably the strongest tool that I have in terms of that easy on ramp that I spoke of previously with regards to fantasy stories in general, because this allows me to, utilizing this allows me to pare down some of the difficulty that's associated with a lot of those proper nouns. Now, obviously, I don't want to, flood the script with proper nouns right off the bat. That's going to turn away anyone, even the biggest fantasy fan, even the person that has the most faith coming in, that's ready to go to bat against some proper nouns. If they see a flood, they're not going to be very charitable. So obviously, I'm not going to flood it, but utilizing this kind of quick, easy, and very painless reference is really going to work wonders with regards to that on ramp that I've been speaking about, because that's very important, especially in a medium as impenetrable as visual novels, for whatever reason, are to the average person. Making the entry point as smooth as possible is very important to me, because I do want people to actually read this. That might seem contradictory considering my general attitude towards the average reader of anything. If you've ever seen any of my opinions online, but I do want to cater to at least a bit of a broader audience with this. Not quite the broadest of audiences, because I'm not retarded, but I do want to spread my wings out a little bit and maybe attract a person or two that maybe they heard about it from a friend. I don't know. That's wishful thinking. Anyways, it's besides the point. Now, returning to the topic of my story, Six in the Woods, specifically, the codex, beyond this previously mentioned function as an easing of the entry into the story, has a very important function in that I intend for there to be a lot of information happening. Because of the nature of these multiple perspectives, there will be a lot of information presented over time that won't come back into play until much, much later, because certain information might be relevant to one character but be irrelevant to another, and you might not come back to that character that information was relevant to for some time. So the codex then becomes very important for refreshing or potentially even elaborating in anticipation of someone using it to refresh. But regardless, I want to make sure that the information presented begins in a broad manner, explaining, very wide stretching, important aspects of the world or the characters, because I intend to kind of layer information as I go on, and that, broad things will be established first, and then later on, smaller things will be added onto those broad topics in order to specify and more clearly define certain things that are a bit more important to the story. I'm going to use some examples, so if you don't want to spoil yourself for a visual novel that some random schmuck is writing and probably won't be out for a few years, then you can skip to 25 minutes and 50 seconds. So I will begin with an example from the Exiles story. His arc, plot-wise, not character-wise, plot-wise, revolves very heavily around the concept of sovereignty goddesses and the role of kingship within this world. Basically, very, very broad strokes definition of those terms is that every region in this world has a kind of personification in the form of a kind of goddess of the land. And the only way that someone can claim kingship over that region and truly rule it is either by marriage to or descent from that sovereignty goddess. So various parts of the world will have, kings that are, directly related to the land which they rule. And a very major plot point is that the time period that this story takes place in is kind of referred to as a kingless age. There aren't really that many kings. And specifically within the bounds of the Great Forest, there is no king at the moment. The forest is ruled by the White Princess. And the Exiles plotline is very heavily entwined with the White Princess. And I want those broader terms of sovereignty goddesses and kingship, I want those to be very base level information that as the audience proceeds through the story will become refined, and when certain elements in the Exiles story, like the White Princess's usurpation of the old king of the forest and her status as a sort of false sovereignty goddess, aren't things that they see and then kind of scratch their heads at and go, huh? I want them to have that knowledge in their heads of the sovereignty goddesses and kingship. And I want them to see those moments, those reveals of, she usurped the old king and she has, she has created a status for herself as a sovereignty goddess when she isn't a personification of the land. I want them to see those reveals and think, oh, okay. And then I want them to kind of think ahead and think, okay, so since she is a false sovereignty goddess and she is, plotting to make the Exile her king, what does that mean for the Great Forest since her power isn't the same? And what does that mean for the Exile's kingship if he does take her up on that offer? Which is a question that will have very far-reaching implications, because by the time this would be revealed, other things will have been revealed that would, in this light, bring up questions about other characters. Because by the time this is revealed, the reader will know the truth of the guide's grudge against the forest and the White Princess more specifically, being that he has inherited the vow of vengeance taken by the old wards of the previous king of the Great Forest. So then the question becomes, with regards to Guide in Exile, is does Guide's goal then shift from slaying the princess to slaying the Exile? And then also with regards to the huntsman, who by now will have built up something of a rapport with the Exile and will have also by now been revealed to be, a few hundred years old thanks to his somewhat otherworldly parentage. He knows what it feels like to be kind of outside the natural order of things. He has seen people he knows and loves. He's seen them grown old while he remained the same. He's been outside of the typical life of a human being. And what kind of insight would he have on this potential kingship, this potential distorted kingship, and what that might afford him? What is his hundreds of years of experience? What does all that time tell him about the decision that is at hand for the Exile, who he sees as a kind of younger version of himself? And I want questions like this to be at the forefront of the reader's mind at all times. And I hope with these few little examples I've illustrated with regards to the 6 main characters, how much information can be going on, being thrown around at any given time. So I want the codex to be something that they can reference and, quickly and easily pull information from in case they have forgotten or misremembered over the long runtime of the typical visual novel, because it's probably going to be pretty fucking long. And I'm hoping by now you can understand why I'm fussing so much about the presentation of any of this information, because imagine if in that previous example, I just completely took out any mention of the old king of the forest. That would leave you with basically just the white princess is somehow a false sovereignty goddess, and she wants to make the exile her king. That doesn't leave any lines to be drawn between the guide. That leaves a very big hole there. And if I, for whatever reason, obviously this wouldn't happen with this specific example, but if I, for whatever reason, left information such as the usurpation of the old king of the forest, if I left that into the codex, then anyone who didn't read the codex would be completely lost. So obviously, I'm not going to. It wouldn't even cross my mind to conceal, or not really conceal, but to leave out such important information as that, and just place it in the codex. But for any number of things that I could deem ancillary, like geographical things or whatever else, that could easily end up being something that could catch a snag in someone's mind. Because from my perspective, as the creator of all of this, I have a very extensive knowledge of all of this information, and if I don't really need the codex. I can look at any of this stuff, and I'll think of when I thought of it. I'll think of how I implemented it, all that kind of stuff. But for any given random average Joe reading this, he can't instantly recall or just summon up that information from out of his mind. So something like the codex, I believe, is going to be integral to a proper understanding of this story for someone other than myself. So that's why I'm fussing so much about something that seems so simple. But I hope by now uh, you'll understand that despite how simple it might be, there's actually a lot to it. Because, like I said at the very beginning, uh, it makes ripples, and it can, at the end of the day, it can make or break the execution of this story. Because in a story like this, and honestly in most stories, how and when information is presented is paramount. But again, especially so for stories that are so based around mystery as this one. But that's all I really had to say about this. If you've listened this long, thank you. I hope that it wasn't too grating. I know I have smacked my lips and said and a lot, but that's mainly because I'm doing this all off rip. Off the top of my head, I have a few things written down of points I wanted to hit because I've been thinking about this. But beyond that, this has all just been right off dome. So it can be a bit scattered, I'm sure. I don't know if I have the fortitude to listen back over it myself, but I might go back and cut out a few smackings of the lips, because I know that at the very least can be very, very awful. But that's about all I had to say. Thank you for listening. This has been Tusk, and I don't know if I'll see you again. I don't know if I'll ever do something like this again. It was kind of fun. I do enjoy running my mouth, and for me at least, talking or writing something down helps me work through my thoughts on it. So this has been very helpful to me for collecting my thoughts on this specific topic, as well as I had fun. I had fun talking for half an hour to myself in my room about nothing in particular. Yeah, good night.